Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Oklahoma. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the summer of 1921, the disappearance of the Ashcroft sisters sent shockwaves through Elmore County, Oklahoma. What began as a simple missing persons case would unravel into one of the most disturbing documented incidents in the state's history. The facts, as they were recorded, tell only part of the story. The rest lies buried in silence, in forgotten documents, and in the memories of those who have tried desperately to forget. It was June 17th when Eleanor and Margaret Ashcroft were last seen walking along the perimeter of their family's property on the outskirts of the small town of Riverbrook. The town itself was unremarkable, a collection of wooden structures, a general store, a post office, and a handful of residential homes nestled between rolling hills and dense woodland. The Ashcroft residence stood apart, a Victorian farmhouse built in 1887, situated on 15 acres of land that bordered Blackwater Creek. According to police reports filed on June 19, 1921, the sisters had gone for their customary evening walk. When they failed to return for supper, their father, Thomas Ashcroft, a respected physician in the community, reportedly searched the property before alerting neighbors. By nightfall, a search party had been organized, but yielded no results. The official search continued for 3 weeks before being formally abandoned. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not merely the disappearance itself, but the circumstances surrounding it, the inexplicable behavior of the family in the months leading up to the event, the contradictory statements from witnesses, and the discovery made in 1967 that would cast the entire narrative in a different light. Before we delve deeper into the disturbing details of this case, it's worth noting that much of what follows has been pieced together from fragmented sources: local newspaper clippings from the Riverbrook Gazette, police statements, personal correspondence between family members that surfaced decades later, and interviews conducted with surviving residents in 1962 by historian Dr. James Holloway for his never-published manuscript, Forgotten Tragedies of Rural Oklahoma. The Ashcroft family had been residents of Riverbrook since 1914, when Thomas Ashcroft relocated his medical practice from Tulsa. His wife, Virginia, was described by neighbors as reserved but polite. The two sisters, Eleanor, 28, and Margaret, 26, lived with their parents despite being of marriageable age, something that generated mild gossip in town but was explained away by their devotion to their ailing mother. The Ashcroft property was notable for its isolation. The nearest neighbor, the Wilson family, lived over a mile away. The house itself was surrounded by a thicket of elm trees that obscured it from the main road. Visitors to the Ashcroft home were rare, though Thomas's position as the town's only physician meant that he was well respected and frequently called upon to attend to the medical needs of Riverbrook's 412 residents. In the months before the disappearance, several townspeople reported changes in the Ashcroft household. Virginia, who had occasionally attended church services at the Riverbrook Methodist Church, stopped appearing altogether. Thomas began closing his practice early on Thursdays and Fridays without explanation. Perhaps most notably, the sisters, who had previously been seen regularly in town purchasing supplies or borrowing books from the small community library, became increasingly reclusive. Meredith Wilson, whose family owned the property adjacent to the Ashcrofts, told Dr. Holloway in 1962, "Something changed in that household around March of 21. The curtains were always drawn. Thomas stopped acknowledging neighbors when he'd pass by in his automobile. And the girls, they used to be such lively young women, they seemed to age years in the span of weeks. Eleanor, in particular, the last time I saw her at the general store, she wouldn't meet my eyes. She had always been so confident before. The day of the disappearance had been unusually warm for June. According to meteorological records, temperatures reached 92 degrees Fahrenheit. Thomas Ashcroft's statement to Sheriff Miller indicated that he had been in town attending to a patient with pneumonia and returned home at approximately 6:30 p.m. to find his wife asleep in her bedroom and no sign of the sisters. In his initial statement, Thomas claimed that the sisters often walked along Blackwater Creek in the evenings, and he assumed they had simply lost track of time. It wasn't until darkness fell that he became concerned. By 9:45 p.m., he had walked to the Wilson residence to inquire if they had seen his daughters. The search that ensued was initially focused on the creek area, with locals speculating that perhaps one sister had fallen into the water and the other had attempted a rescue. However, the creek was shallow in June, rarely exceeding 3 feet in depth, making drowning unlikely for 2 adult women. No signs of struggle were found along the banks, no personal items were recovered, and tracking dogs brought in from the county seat lost the scent approximately half a mile from the house, at a point where the sisters' path intersected with an old logging road. Virginia Ashcroft, bedridden with what Thomas described as nervous exhaustion, was never formally interviewed by authorities. Her absence from the investigation raised few eyebrows at the time. Women of her standing were often shielded from distressing matters, but would later become a point of contention among those who revisited the case. By early July, the disappearance of the Ashcroft sisters had been relegated to occasional mentions in the Riverbrook Gazette. The prevailing theory became that the sisters had voluntarily left town, perhaps to seek opportunities in one of Oklahoma's growing cities, or even to travel west to California. This theory was bolstered by Thomas Ashcroft himself, who in late July told Sheriff Miller that he had discovered some of his daughter's clothing and personal items missing, suggesting they had packed before leaving. This explanation satisfied most of Riverbrook's residents. The post-war period had seen many young people leave rural communities for urban opportunities. Yet there were inconsistencies that troubled a few observers. Neither sister had accessed their modest savings accounts at Riverbrook's small bank. No train station within 50 miles reported selling tickets to women, matching their description. And most perplexingly, neither had collected the mail order packages that arrived for them at the post office on June 21st. Packages that Eleanor had specifically mentioned looking forward to receiving, according to the postmaster's wife. For 2 years, life in Riverbrook continued. Thomas maintained his medical practice, though he became increasingly selective about which patients he would see. Virginia was rarely spotted outside the home. In September of 1923, the Ashcrofts sold their property and relocated, reportedly to Arizona, due to Virginia's health concerns. The house remained empty for nearly a year before being purchased by the Johnston family, who would own it until 1958. The case might have been forgotten entirely if not for a severe storm in April 1967, which caused significant damage to the old Ashcroft property, by then owned by a retired couple named Davis. The storm uprooted one of the massive elm trees that had stood for generations near the eastern edge of the property, approximately 200 yards from the main house. According to the official report filed by Sheriff Walter Pruitt on April 17, 1967, Mr. Davis discovered what appeared to be human remains while clearing the fallen tree. The roots had torn up a significant portion of earth, revealing what would later be identified as partial skeletal remains. The report states that bones appeared to have been in the ground for many years, and notes that they were found alongside deteriorated fabric consistent with women's clothing from the 1920s era. The Lee subsequent investigation reopened the long-dormant case of the Ashcroft sisters. Forensic examination confirmed that the remains belonged to at least one adult female, estimated to have been in her late 20s at time of death. The cause of death could not be conclusively determined due to the condition of the remains, though the medical examiner noted unusual markings on the cervical vertebrae consistent with potential strangulation. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of a small metal box buried alongside the remains. Inside was a journal, its pages largely destroyed by decades of exposure to the elements. However, several passages remained legible, and the handwriting was confirmed by former neighbors to belong to Eleanor Ashcroft. One of the few complete entries, dated May 3, 1921, reads, "Mother's condition worsens daily. Father says the new treatment will help, but I have my doubts. The basement room is prepared. Margaret doesn't know yet. I cannot bear to tell her what I've heard at night." Another fragment, dated June the 1st. "The sounds from below are unbearable. Father says it's necessary, says Mother needs complete isolation for the treatment to work. Margaret has begun to ask questions. I've told her nothing, but she suspects. The locked door, the trays of food that return untouched." The final legible entry, dated June 15th, just 2 days before the disappearance. "I found the key. Tonight, when Father leaves for his meeting in town, Margaret and I will see for ourselves. Whatever is happening in that room must end." These fragments transformed the understanding of the case entirely. Local authorities attempted to locate Thomas and Virginia Ashcroft, only to discover that Thomas had died in 1946 in Phoenix, Arizona. Virginia's fate was less clear. No death certificate was found, and no record of her existed after the family's departure from Riverbrook. The investigation that followed revealed several disturbing facts that had been overlooked in 1921. Thomas Ashcroft's medical credentials, which had never been questioned during his time in Riverbrook, proved impossible to verify. The basement of the Ashcroft home, examined in 1967, contained a small room with unusual modifications, a heavy door with external bolt locks, and walls that had been lined with some form of padding, now largely rotted away. Most telling were the statements from Meredith Wilson and other neighbors, who recalled that Virginia Ashcroft had begun displaying unusual behavior in late 1920. Thomas had explained to concerned friends that his wife suffered from female hysteria and required his specialized care at home. No one had seen Virginia after February 1921, though Thomas assured the community that she was recovering slowly under his constant attention. Harold Jenkins, who had worked briefly as an assistant in Thomas's medical practice in early 1921, provided a telling statement to investigators in 1967. Dr. Ashcroft was very secretive about his wife's condition. He mixed strange compounds in the back room, things I'd never seen used in standard medical practice. Once I heard sounds from the doctor's bag, like glass vials clinking together, and he became very agitated when I mentioned it. He dismissed me the following week with no explanation. The investigation could not conclusively determine whether the remains found belonged to Eleanor or Margaret Ashcroft, nor could it locate the remains of the second sister. The case officially remains unsolved, classified as a suspected homicide with no possibility of prosecution due to the presumed death of all involved parties. What happened in the Ashcroft home during those spring months of 1921? The prevailing theory, developed by investigators in 1967 and expanded upon by criminologist Dr. Rebecca Hayes in her 1968 analysis, Domestic Shadows: Hidden Crimes of Rural America, suggests a disturbing scenario. Hayes posits that Virginia Ashcroft may have suffered from a legitimate mental or physical condition that her husband attempted to treat using unorthodox, possibly experimental methods. The basement room, she suggests, was a makeshift treatment facility that evolved into a prison. The sisters, upon discovering their mother's condition, threatened to expose Thomas's activities. The psychological profile that emerges, writes Hayes, is of a man whose professional identity was inextricably linked to his ability to cure his wife. When conventional treatments failed, he likely turned to more extreme measures, possibly influenced by the controversial psychiatric practices of the era. The sisters' discovery presented an immediate threat to both his professional standing and his freedom. Whether Virginia was already deceased by June 1921 remains unknown. The journal fragments suggest she was alive but in distress. One theory proposes that Thomas murdered one sister, likely Eleanor, based on the journal ownership, and forced Margaret to assist in the burial before later disposing of her as well. An alternative suggests that Thomas may have convinced Margaret that Eleanor's death was an accident, maintaining control over her through manipulation or threats until they left Riverbrook, at which point Margaret may have met a similar fate. The Ashcroft case exemplifies how rural isolation can conceal tragedy. In a small community where a doctor's word was rarely questioned, where women's nervous conditions were accepted without scrutiny, and where the disappearance of adult women could be explained away as voluntary departure, the truth remained buried, quite literally, for decades. The property changed hands several times after the 1967 discovery. Locals report that no owner has stayed longer than 5 years. The house itself was demolished in 1972 after repeated failures to sell it. Today, the land remains undeveloped, a conspicuous empty space among the otherwise populated area that Riverbrook has become. In 1969, a memorial stone was placed in Riverbrook Cemetery for Eleanor and Margaret Ashcroft, though no remains are interred there. Local residents occasionally leave flowers, a belated acknowledgement of the community's failure to protect two of its own. The most unsettling aspect of the Ashcroft case is perhaps not what we know, but what remains unknown. The full contents of Eleanor's journal, the fate of Virginia Ashcroft, the exact circumstances of the sisters' final moments, these details are lost to time, buried as effectively as the remains beneath the elm tree. Dr. Hayes, in the conclusion of her analysis, offers this sobering reflection. The walls of the Ashcroft home contained secrets that the community chose not to see. This willful blindness, this collective agreement to accept the simplest explanation rather than confront the possibility of horror occurring in their midst, enabled Thomas Ashcroft to literally get away with murder. The case files, including photographs of the remains and the journal fragments, were archived in the Oklahoma State Police records in 1968. A fire in the records department in 1969 destroyed many of these materials, leaving only photocopies of select documents. Dr. Holloway's manuscript, which contained the most comprehensive collection of witness statements, was never published due to his sudden death in 1964. His research notes were donated to the University of Oklahoma's Historical Archives, but were reportedly misplaced during a department relocation in 1965. This pattern of lost evidence has led some to suggest that the full truth of the Ashcroft case was deliberately obscured. While there is no concrete evidence of such a conspiracy, the timing is certainly convenient for anyone who might have wished the case to remain unsolved. What we know with certainty is limited. 2 women vanished in 1921. Human remains were discovered in 1967. A journal suggested troubling circumstances within the Ashcroft household. And a doctor with questionable credentials created a prison within his home for at least one family member. The town of Riverbrook has since been absorbed into the expanding boundaries of a larger neighboring city. Few residents today know the story of the Ashcroft sisters. The elm trees that once surrounded the property have mostly been cleared for development, though locals claim that one particular section remains persistently undeveloped due to construction complications. In 1968, an elderly woman appeared at the Riverbrook Cemetery, placing flowers at the newly installed memorial stone. When approached by the groundskeeper, she identified herself only as a former friend of the Ashcroft family. She was described as well-dressed, with a noticeable tremor in her right hand. Before leaving, she placed a small object beside the flowers, a tarnished house key. The groundskeeper, finding this behavior unusual, noted the woman's license plate and reported it to Sheriff Pruitt, who discovered the car was registered to a Margaret Johnson of Amarillo, Texas. Investigators traveled to the address listed, but found the house vacant. Neighbors reported that an elderly woman had indeed lived there briefly, but had moved out suddenly the previous week, leaving no forwarding address. The investigation into whether this woman might have been Margaret Ashcroft, somehow having survived the events of 1921, was never concluded, as resources were diverted to more pressing cases. The possibility that Margaret Ashcroft survived, perhaps coerced into assuming a new identity and living with the knowledge of what happened to her sister and mother, adds another layer of horror to an already disturbing case. If she was indeed the woman at the cemetery, what prompted her to return after nearly 50 years of silence? And why did she disappear again so quickly? In the absence of definitive answers, the Ashcroft case has become a cautionary tale about the darkness that can exist behind respectable facades. Thomas Ashcroft, by all accounts, was a trusted figure in Riverbrook, a physician who held the community's health in his hands. That such a man could potentially orchestrate the imprisonment and likely murder of his own family members while maintaining his standing in society speaks to the dangerous power of authority and isolation. The house itself, according to those who lived there after the Ashcrofts, always felt wrong. Martha Johnston, who resided there from 1924 to 1958, told investigators in 1967 that certain areas of the house, particularly the basement and the eastern side of the property, felt inexplicably cold, even in summer. She described persistent nightmares during her first years in the house, often featuring a woman standing silently at the foot of her bed. While such accounts might be dismissed as the product of suggestion after learning the property's history, the consistency of such reports across multiple residents is notable. The Davis family, who discovered the remains, had already planned to sell the property before the discovery, citing an oppressive atmosphere that had affected their sleep and general well-being since moving in. The elm tree that concealed Eleanor Ashcroft's remains for 46 years was estimated to be approximately 40 years old when it fell, suggesting it had been planted shortly after the burial, perhaps a deliberate attempt by Thomas to mark or obscure the site. The location, relatively distant from the house but still within the property boundaries, indicates premeditation rather than panic. The shallow depth of the burial suggests haste, but the inclusion of the journal, which directly implicated Thomas, remains puzzling. Was it oversight? Or did Thomas believe the journal's degradation would be complete long before discovery, if discovery ever occurred? The most complete theory of events, as reconstructed by Dr. Hayes and supplemented by Sheriff Pruitt's investigation, suggests the following timeline. Virginia Ashcroft began exhibiting symptoms of an unidentified condition in late 1920. Thomas, perhaps out of genuine concern initially, began treating her at home. As her condition deteriorated, or as his treatments caused further harm, he converted the basement room into a confinement space, effectively imprisoning his wife under the guise of medical necessity. The sisters, initially accepting their father's explanation, grew suspicious as months passed with no improvement in their mother's condition. Eleanor discovered evidence of questionable treatments, or perhaps confirmed that Virginia was being mistreated. She documented her concerns in her journal and planned with Margaret to investigate further in Thomas's absence. On or around June 17, 1921, the sisters likely confronted their father with what they had discovered. The confrontation turned violent, resulting in Eleanor's death. Whether intentional or accidental is unknown. Thomas buried her body on the property and convinced or coerced Margaret into compliance, possibly by threatening her with a similar fate or by manipulating her into believing she was complicit in her sister's death. For the next 2 years, Thomas maintained appearances in Riverbrook while keeping Margaret under his control. Virginia either died from her condition, from Thomas's treatments, or was killed to eliminate a witness. When Thomas sold the property in 1923, he likely disposed of any remaining evidence and relocated with Margaret, who either escaped at some point to establish a new identity or remained under his influence until his death in 1946. This reconstruction, while plausible, cannot account for all the gaps in the evidence. The fate of Virginia's body, the exact circumstances of Eleanor's death, and Margaret's subsequent life or death remain speculative. What this case demonstrates, beyond its immediate horror, is how vulnerable women were in early 20th century, rural America. Without financial independence, with limited social support systems, and with medical authority concentrated in men like Thomas Ashcroft, women like Virginia, Eleanor, and Margaret had few protections against domestic tyranny. Their community, while not malicious, failed them through its unwillingness to look too closely at troubling signs. The Ashcroft case is not unique in this regard. Similar cases from the era, the Baxter family in Maine, 1924, the Wyeth disappearances in Missouri, 1919, the Caldwell Sanitarium scandal in upstate New York, 1922, all share common elements: isolated locations, medical or psychiatric justifications for confinement, and the extraordinary power wielded by male authority figures over the women in their care. What distinguishes the Ashcroft case is the tantalizing possibility that one sister may have survived, carrying the burden of knowledge for decades before making one brief, cryptic appearance at her sister's memorial. If the woman at the cemetery in 1968 was indeed Margaret Ashcroft, she would have been approximately 73 years old, certainly within the realm of possibility. Her disappearance following the cemetery visit suggests either a deliberate choice to maintain her anonymity or, more troublingly, outside intervention to maintain the case's unresolved status. The land where the Ashcroft house once stood remains vacant to this day. Local development has circled around it, leaving an conspicuous empty space among otherwise developed neighborhoods. In 1973, a proposal to build a small park on the site was abandoned after multiple construction workers reported equipment failures and unusual accidents. While likely coincidental, such events have contributed to the property's ominous reputation. For those who study historic crimes, the Ashcroft case represents a perfect storm of circumstances that enabled domestic horror to remain hidden. Rural, isolation, medical authority, social constraints on women, and a community more comfortable with simple explanations than disturbing truths. As Dr. Hayes noted in her final assessment of the case, what happened to the Ashcroft women wasn't just a failure of one man's humanity, but a failure of an entire social system. The very structures meant to protect medicine, community, family, instead, concealed and enabled. That is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this case, not that a monster existed, but that the world around him was built in a way that allowed him to operate undetected. The final page of Sheriff Pruitt's report, dated December 12, 1968, notes that the investigation was being officially closed due to insurmountable evidentiary challenges and the presumed death of all involved parties. A handwritten note in the margin initialed by Pruitt adds, "Some doors are better left unopened. God have mercy on their souls." The Ashcroft case reminds us that the most profound horrors often occur not in isolated incidents of violence, but in sustained, intimate betrayals behind closed doors. It forces us to consider how many similar cases may have occurred, and may still occur, in places where isolation and authority create perfect conditions for concealment. Today, the elm trees that once surrounded the Ashcroft property are gone, the house demolished, the physical evidence largely lost to time. Yet something of the case persists in local memory. Residents still avoid the vacant lot after dark. Parents instinctively guide their children away from its boundaries. And occasionally visitors to the Riverbrook Cemetery report seeing an elderly woman standing silently before the memorial stone, though she vanishes when approached. Whether such sightings are genuine or merely the product of a community still processing a decades-old trauma is impossible to determine. What remains certain is that beneath the surface of even the most ordinary-seeming communities, darkness can take root and flourish when no one is willing to look too closely at the silences, the absences, and the convenient explanations that don't quite fit the facts. The Ashcroft sisters disappeared on a warm summer evening in 1921. One was found, decades later, beneath an elm tree planted to conceal her grave. The other vanished into history, perhaps surviving to briefly visit her sister's memorial before disappearing again. Their mother's fate remains unknown, and the man responsible likely lived out his days in freedom, the full extent of his actions known only to himself. In 1961, 5 years before the storm that would unearth Eleanor Ashcroft's remains, a journalism student from the University of Oklahoma named Robert Chambers visited Riverbrook as part of a project documenting small-town histories across the state. During his research, he interviewed several elderly residents, including Edith Miller, the 83-year-old widow of Sheriff Miller, who had handled the original disappearance case. According to Chambers' notes, which were discovered among Dr. Holloway's papers, Mrs. Miller shared a detail that her husband had never included in official reports. "The night the girls went missing," she recalled, "my husband came home past midnight, white as a sheet. He'd been searching with the others, you see. He told me he'd gone to speak with Dr. Ashcroft alone to get more details about when exactly he'd last seen his daughters. He said when he approached the house, all the lights were out except for one in the basement. He looked through the window, just a small rectangle at ground level, and saw the doctor kneeling on the floor, scrubbing at something. My husband knocked at the front door, and when the doctor answered, he was wearing different clothes then. What my husband had seen him in through the window. His hands were red and raw, like he'd been washing them with lye soap. My husband never put that in his report. He said he had no proof of anything, just a feeling that something wasn't right." This account, never corroborated and considered hearsay by investigators in 1967, nonetheless adds another disturbing layer to the case. If accurate, it suggests that Sheriff Miller may have harbored suspicions about Thomas Ashcroft from the Eostres, beginning but lacked the evidence, or perhaps the will, to pursue them. Another tantalizing piece of evidence emerged in 1965 when renovations to the Riverbrook post office uncovered a letter that had slipped behind a sorting cabinet decades earlier. The envelope, addressed to the Oklahoma State Medical Board and bearing Eleanor Ashcroft's name as sender, was postmarked June 16, 1921, the day before the sisters disappeared. The letter itself was missing, presumably removed from the envelope before it was lost, but its existence raises questions about what Eleanor might have been attempting to report. In his notes, Dr. Holloway speculated that Eleanor may have been preparing to expose her father's questionable medical practices or treatment of her mother. If Thomas discovered this letter before it was sent, or learned that a similar letter had already been mailed, it could have provided the catalyst for violence. The official investigation in 1967 also uncovered unusual financial transactions in Thomas Ashcroft's banking records. In April and May of 1921, he made several large withdrawals from his account at Riverbrook Bank. The funds were never deposited elsewhere, according to available records. One theory suggests that Thomas was preparing for a potential need to flee, converting assets to cash that could not be traced. Another possibility is that the money was used to purchase supplies or equipment related to his wife's treatment, items that he would not want to be associated with his medical practice. Further complicating the picture is a statement provided by Joseph Blackwood, a former railroad worker who had been employed at the Milford Junction station approximately 20 miles from Riverbrook. Interviewed in 1967, the elderly Blackwood recalled a man matching Thomas Ashcroft's description arriving at the station in late June 1921 with a woman who appeared to be sedated or ill. She could barely stand, Blackwood told investigators. The man said she was his sister suffering from tuberculosis, and they were traveling to a sanitarium in Colorado. I remember thinking it was strange because he kept his hand on her arm. The whole time, and whenever anyone approached, he would move between them and the woman like he was shielding her or preventing her from speaking. If this account is accurate, it raises the possibility that Margaret Ashcroft did not disappear at the same time or in the same manner as her sister. Perhaps Thomas, after killing Eleanor, forced Margaret to accompany him on a journey intended to establish the narrative that both sisters had left town voluntarily. What happened to Margaret after this sighting remains unknown, but it suggests that her fate may have differed from Eleanor's immediate burial on the property. Another significant development occurred in March 1968 when investigators located Irene Foster, a former nurse who had worked briefly at a private sanitarium in Flagstaff, Arizona, in 1923. Foster reported that a doctor matching Thomas Ashcroft's description had admitted a female patient in November of that year. The patient, whose name Foster recalled as Margaret Johnson, was described as catatonic and suffering from severe melancholia. The strange thing, Foster told investigators, was that the doctor visited her nearly every day, which was unusual for patients whose families had committed them. He would sit with her for hours, sometimes just watching her, sometimes whispering to her. The few times I entered the room during these visits, he would become very agitated and insist I leave immediately. After about 2 months, he stopped coming, and shortly after that, the woman was transferred to another facility. I never knew where she went. This account suggests the possibility that Margaret survived for at least 2 years after the disappearance, perhaps held in a state of psychological captivity by her father. If Margaret Johnson was indeed Margaret Ashcroft, and if she was later the same Margaret Johnson who visited the cemetery in 1968, it would mean she had somehow escaped her father's control and established an independent life, but had never revealed the truth about what happened to her family. The transfer records from the Flagstaff Sanitarium were destroyed in a fire in 1937, leaving this lead impossible to verify completely. However, investigators did confirm that a Thomas Johnson, matching Ashcroft's general description, had practiced medicine briefly in Flagstaff in 1923 before relocating to Phoenix in 1924. Another account that adds to the complexity of the case comes from Richard Davis, the man who discovered the remains in 1967. In a supplementary interview conducted in 1968, Davis mentioned something he had initially forgotten. When he and his wife first moved into the house in 1965, they found a small glass vial hidden in a recess behind a loose brick in the basement. The vial contained a clear liquid that had mostly evaporated over time, leaving a crystalline residue. Thinking nothing of it, Davis had discarded the vial. In retrospect, he wondered if it might have been related to the treatments Thomas Ashcroft administered to his wife. Forensic chemists consulted by investigators suggested that based on the description of the residue, the substance might have been a solution of morphine or another opiate, commonly used in the era to calm patients with supposed psychiatric conditions. Alternatively, it could have been one of several experimental compounds that were being explored in psychiatric treatment during the early 1920s, many of which were later determined to be harmful. This finding lends credence to the theory that Thomas was indeed medicating, perhaps over-medicating Virginia, possibly causing or exacerbating the very condition he claimed to be treating. The concealment of the vial suggests he was aware that his methods would not withstand scrutiny from other medical professionals. The basement room itself, examined thoroughly in 1967, contained several unusual features that had been partially obscured by subsequent renovations. The padding on the walls, mostly deteriorated, appeared to have been a combination of quilted fabric and some form of insulation, likely intended to muffle sound. The door had been replaced, but the frame still showed evidence of multiple heavy duty, locks having been installed on the outside. Small holes near the ceiling suggested that some form of restraint system may have been anchored there. The concrete floor, when partially removed during the investigation, revealed dark stains that forensic analysis identified as likely blood, though the age of the stains made more specific identification impossible. These details paint a disturbing picture of a space designed not merely for isolation, but for forcible confinement, a prison cell disguised as a treatment room. Whether its primary occupant was Virginia, as Eleanor's journal suggests, or whether it later held one or both of the sisters, remains speculative. In October 1968, a final piece of the puzzle emerged when an antique dealer in Phoenix contacted Oklahoma authorities. The dealer had purchased the contents of a storage unit that had been abandoned after its renter, a Thomas Johnson, had died in 1946. Among the items was a leather medical bag containing several journals. One of these, dating from 1920 to 1923, appeared to be a treatment log for a patient identified only as V.A. The entries described an unspecified nervous condition that progressively worsened despite, or perhaps because of, the treatments administered. Early entries show a clinical detachment, but as the journal progresses, the writing becomes more erratic, with passages suggesting that the doctor viewed his patient's condition as a personal affront to his medical abilities. The final entries, dated May 1921, contain disturbing statements such as, "Patient resists all conventional treatments, more aggressive approach necessary, complete isolation, and advanced therapeutic regimen to begin tomorrow. Will not be defeated by her weakness." The journal contained no entries about Eleanor or Margaret directly, though several passages alluded to interference and misguided sympathies that were hampering the treatment process. The final page contained a single sentence, dated June 18, 1921. All obstacles removed. Treatment can now proceed without interruption. Handwriting analysis confirmed that the journal was written by the same hand that had signed Thomas Ashcroft's statements to Sheriff Miller in 1921. This document provided the strongest evidence yet of Thomas's declining mental state and his possible motivations for violence against his family. The antique dealer also reported finding a collection of photographs in the storage unit, including several of a young woman who appeared to be in her 20s, taken in various locations across the southwestern United States between 1923 and 1946. While the woman's identity could not be conclusively established, investigators believed she bore a strong resemblance to Margaret Ashcroft based on earlier photographs. In some of the later images, the woman appeared healthy and was smiling, sometimes in the company of others, suggesting she may have established some form of normal life. This discovery led to a new theory. Perhaps Margaret had initially been coerced into leaving with her father, possibly through a combination of manipulation, threats, and medication. Over time, she may have developed Stockholm Syndrome or otherwise accommodated to her situation, eventually gaining enough freedom to function in society while maintaining the fiction of being Thomas Johnson's daughter or sister. After his death in 1946, she might have finally been able to establish complete independence, explaining her appearance as Margaret Johnson in Amarillo decades later. If this theory is correct, Margaret Ashcroft lived a double life for decades. Outwardly, free but inwardly captive to the knowledge of what had happened to her mother and sister, and perhaps to fear of her father, even after his death. Her brief appearance at the memorial stone in 1968, followed by her immediate relocation, suggests she may have been seeking closure while still fearing exposure or other consequences of her past. The Ashcroft case was officially closed in December 1968, with most of those involved in the original events presumed deceased. Sheriff Pruitt's final report concluded, while substantial circumstantial evidence suggests criminal activity on the part of Thomas Ashcroft in relation to the disappearance and probable death of Eleanor Ashcroft and the questionable treatment of Virginia Ashcroft, insufficient forensic evidence exists to determine the exact nature and extent of these crimes. The potential survival of Margaret Ashcroft as Margaret Johnson presents a compelling but ultimately unprovable theory. This department considers the investigation complete, barring the emergence of new evidence or the voluntary testimony of Margaret Johnson, should she indeed be Margaret Ashcroft. In the decades since the investigation closed, the Ashcroft case has occasionally resurfaced in academic studies of historical crimes and in the collective memory of the region. A 1978 book by criminologist Edward Blackwell, The Doctor's Daughter's Medicine and Murder in Rural America, dedicated a chapter to the case, drawing parallels between Thomas Ashcroft and other medical practitioners who abused their authority in isolated communities. Blackwell's research uncovered additional context about the medical practices of the era that shed light on Thomas Ashcroft's possible motivations and methods. The early 1920s represented a transitional period in psychiatric treatment, when traditional moral therapy approaches were giving way to more invasive biological interventions. Hydrotherapy, insulin shock therapy, and early forms of psychosurgery were gaining prominence, often with minimal evidence of efficacy and little oversight, particularly in rural areas. For a physician like Ashcroft, Blackwell wrote, operating without peer review in an isolated community, the temptation to experiment with these emerging techniques would have been considerable. Add to this the personal stake of treating his own wife, whose condition might have been perceived as a reflection on his professional capabilities, and you have a dangerous combination of factors. Blackwell also noted the significance of the broader historical context. The Ashcroft case unfolded during a period of profound social change in America. The aftermath of World War I, the Spanish flu pandemic, and the social upheavals of the early 1920s created an atmosphere of uncertainty and instability. In rural Oklahoma, still reeling from these events and the economic challenges they presented, a respected doctor's explanation for his family's troubles would have been readily accepted without much scrutiny. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, occurring just weeks before the Ashcroft sisters' disappearance less than 100 miles away, had dominated regional attention and resources. Sheriff Miller, like many law enforcement officials in the area, had been called to assist with the aftermath of the massacre, potentially explaining his limited capacity to thoroughly investigate the disappearances when they occurred. In 1982, construction workers preparing the vacant Ashcroft property for development made another disturbing discovery. While excavating for a foundation near where the original house had stood, they uncovered a small metal container buried approximately 4 feet below ground. Inside was a collection of personal items, a woman's silver hairbrush with the initials VA engraved on the handle, a wedding band, and several pages of what appeared to be a journal, though water damage had rendered most of the text illegible. One partially readable passage stated, "What cannot continue this way. The treatments grow worse. T believes he can cure me, but I fear what he's becoming. If anyone finds this, please know." The remainder of the text was lost to water damage, but the implication was clear. Virginia Ashcroft had attempted to create a record of her experiences, perhaps anticipating that she would not be able to share them directly. The location of the container, buried at a depth that would require deliberate effort, suggests she may have convinced someone to hide it for her, possibly one of her daughters, or managed to bury it herself during a rare moment of freedom. This discovery renewed interest in the case briefly, though it added little concrete information to what was already known or suspected. The property remained undeveloped, with the construction company abandoning the project shortly after the discovery, citing financing issues, though local rumors suggested workers had refused to continue after a series of unexplained equipment failures and accidents. In 1994, historian Maria Holloway, daughter of Dr. James Holloway, published her father's unfinished manuscript with additional research of her own. Forgotten Tragedies, The Lost History of Rural Oklahoma, included the most comprehensive account of the Ashcroft case to date, incorporating previously unpublished interviews and materials from her father's research. Among these was a 1962 interview with Catherine Lewis, who had worked briefly as a housekeeper for the Ashcrofts in early 1921. Lewis, who was 85 at the time of the interview and died shortly thereafter, described witnessing disturbing interactions. Within the household, Dr. Ashcroft would lock himself in the basement for hours with Mrs. Ashcroft. I could hear her crying sometimes, begging him to stop whatever he was doing. Once I saw her afterward. She looked like a ghost, barely able to walk with strange marks on her arms. When I asked Miss Eleanor about it, she just shook her head and said her father knew best. But her hands were shaking when she said it. Lewis also reported overhearing arguments between Thomas and Eleanor in the weeks before the disappearance. She had started to question him. I heard her say once that what he was doing wasn't treatment, it was torture. He told her she didn't understand medicine and should keep her opinions to herself. After that, he started locking the medicine cabinet and his office door, even when he was home. This account supports the theory that Eleanor had grown increasingly concerned about her mother's treatment and was contemplating some form of intervention. It also suggests that Thomas was aware of her doubts and had begun taking precautions against her interference. Perhaps the most intriguing development in the case came in 2003, when the Riverbrook Historical Society received an anonymous donation, a package containing a leather-bound journal and a brief typewritten note that stated simply, "The final testament of Margaret Ashcroft Johnson, to be opened 50 years after my death." Forensic analysis confirmed that the journal was indeed from the 1920s era, though the authenticity of its contents could not be definitively established. The journal began with entries from 1921 describing Margaret's growing concerns about her mother's condition and her father's increasingly erratic behavior. The entries confirmed much of what had been speculated. Virginia was being kept in the basement room, subjected to various treatments that seemed to be worsening her condition. Eleanor had discovered documentation of these treatments and was planning to contact medical authorities, and both sisters had agreed to investigate the basement room in their father's absence. The entry dated June 17, 1921, the day of the disappearance, described in harrowing detail what allegedly occurred. "We found Mother barely conscious, strapped to a bed. She didn't recognize us at first. There were marks on her arms from injections, and she was so thin like she hadn't been properly fed in weeks. Eleanor began untying her while I gathered Mother's things. We intended to take her to the Wilsons' farm to get help. But Father returned unexpectedly. He became enraged when he saw what we were doing. He struck Eleanor with something, I couldn't see what, and she fell against the wall. There was so much blood. Mother was screaming. He told me Eleanor was dead, that it was my fault for interfering, and that no one would believe me if I told them what happened. He said they would think I had killed her out of jealousy. He made me help him bury her body under the elm tree. He said, if I ever told anyone, he would say I had done it all, and he would make sure I suffered the same way Mother had." The journal detailed how Thomas forced Margaret to send letters to several acquaintances in nearby towns, post-dated over several weeks, describing a fictional journey to California. He kept Virginia heavily sedated and relocated her to a private sanitarium in Arizona in 1923 under an assumed name. Margaret wrote that she believed her mother died there in 1925, though she was never allowed to see the body. For years, according to the journal, Thomas maintained strict control over Margaret through a combination of threats, psychological manipulation, and occasional administration of sedatives. He established a new identity for them in Arizona as Thomas and Margaret Johnson, presenting her variously as his daughter, sister, or niece, as the situation required. The journal described how, after Thomas's death in 1946, Margaret gradually built an independent life, though she remained haunted by the events of 1921. She wrote of recurring nightmares, persistent fear of being discovered, and overwhelming guilt about her role in concealing Eleanor's murder and her inability to save her mother. The final entries, dated 1968, described Margaret's decision to visit the memorial stone in Riverbrook after learning about it through a newspaper article. She wrote of placing the house key beside the flowers, the key to the basement room that had been the catalyst for the tragedy, as a symbolic gesture of closure. After being spotted at the cemetery, she relocated to avoid questioning, ultimately settling in a small town in New Mexico under yet another name. The journal's final page contained a passage that read, "I have carried this burden for nearly 50 years. I was too young, too afraid to stand against my father when it mattered. By the time I found the courage, it was too late for Eleanor and Mother. I have lived with their ghosts every day since. I leave this record not to excuse my complicity, but to give them the justice they were denied in life. May God forgive me for my silence. Eleanor, Mother, I am sorry." The authenticity of this journal cannot be conclusively verified, and some researchers have suggested it may be an elaborate hoax. However, handwriting analysis showed similarities. To the few known samples of Margaret Ashcroft's writing from before 1921, and certain details in the account align with evidence that was not publicly available, lending credence to its possible authenticity. If genuine, the journal provides the most complete account of what happened to the Ashcroft women and confirms many of the theories developed by investigators in the 1960s. It portrays Thomas Ashcroft not as a calculating monster, but as a man whose professional arrogance and inability to accept failure led him down an increasingly dark path, ultimately resulting in the destruction of his entire family. The journal also offers insight into how Margaret survived psychologically by compartmentalizing her traumatic experiences and eventually creating a new identity separate from her past. Her decision to provide this account decades later, to be revealed only after her death, suggests both a desire for truth and a persistent fear of its consequences. In 2012, ground-penetrating radar was used to survey the former Ashcroft property as part of an archaeological study of historical sites in the region. The survey revealed several anomalies consistent with prior disturbances of the soil in areas apart from where Eleanor's partial remains had been discovered. Limited excavation of one such area uncovered fabric fragments and a small collection of personal items, including a silver locket containing a faded photograph of what appeared to be Virginia and her daughters, but no additional human remains. This finding raised the possibility that Thomas might have buried Virginia somewhere on the property as well, though her remains have never been found. Alternatively, as suggested in the purported Margaret Johnson journal, Virginia may have died in Arizona and been buried there under an assumed name. The Ashcroft case, now a century old, continues to resonate because it exemplifies how power, isolation, and societal expectations can create perfect conditions for hidden horrors. In a community where a doctor's word was law, where women's health concerns were often dismissed as hysteria, and where family matters were considered strictly private, Thomas Ashcroft was able to imprison, experiment upon, and ultimately destroy his family while maintaining his respected position in society. The case also illustrates the profound impact of trauma across generations. The property where the Ashcroft house once stood remains undeveloped to this day, surrounded by modern homes and businesses, but conspicuously empty. Local residents still speak of strange sensations when passing the lot, unexpected cold spots, the feeling of being watched, and inexplicable heaviness in the air. Whether these experiences stem from suggestion or something more is impossible to determine, but they speak to how deeply the tragedy has embedded itself in the community's consciousness. For criminologists and historians, the Ashcroft case represents an important example of how domestic violence and medical abuse could be concealed in early 20th century America, particularly in rural settings. The case has been cited in numerous studies of historical crime patterns and has informed modern approaches to investigating potential cases of medical misconduct and familial abuse. As Dr. Rebecca Hayes wrote in her final analysis, the tragedy of the Ashcroft women lies not just in what happened to them, but in how easily it could have been prevented had the community been willing to look beyond appearances. Every society creates blind spots, areas where we choose not to look too closely, because what we might find would challenge our fundamental assumptions about the people and institutions we trust. The Ashcroft case reminds us that what lurks in these blind spots can be monstrous, and that our unwillingness to see can make us complicit in horrors that unfold in plain sight. The final fate of Margaret Ashcroft, if she indeed was the author of the journal donated to the Historical Society, remains unknown. The directive that the journal be kept sealed for 50 years after her death suggests she may have died shortly after writing it in the early 2000s, which would mean the journal could be made public around 2050. Whether this instruction will be honored or whether further investigation might reveal more about her later life remains to be seen. What is certain is that on a warm June evening in 1921, something terrible happened at the Ashcroft home. One sister was buried beneath an elm tree, her remains discovered only by chance decades later. The other disappeared into history, perhaps, carrying the burden of knowledge and complicity throughout a long life of hiding. Their mother vanished from public view months earlier, her fate a matter of speculation. And the man responsible transformed from respected physician to likely murderer through a process so gradual that those around him failed to recognize the danger until it was too late. The vacant lot where the Ashcroft house once stood serves as a permanent reminder of what can happen when authority goes unquestioned, when women's voices are silenced, and when communities choose comfortable lies over disturbing truths. In the quiet emptiness of that space, the echoes of what happened a century ago continue to resonate, a cautionary tale about the horrors that can exist behind respectable facades and the terrible consequences of looking away. In Oklahoma's official records, the Ashcroft case remains classified as unsolved. In the hearts and minds of those familiar with its details, however, the truth seems clear, even if justice was never served. Eleanor and Virginia Ashcroft were victims of a man whose professional identity and personal authority mattered more to him than their lives. Margaret Ashcroft was both victim and reluctant accomplice, forced by fear and manipulation to participate. In concealing crimes she was powerless to prevent. Their story, pieced together from fragments of evidence, contradictory accounts, and the passage of almost a century, remains incomplete. Yet in that incompleteness lies perhaps the most disturbing truth of all, that some horrors can never be fully understood or explained, only survived and remembered. The shadows of the Ashcroft case have stretched across decades, touching all who encounter it with a chill recognition of how easily darkness can hide behind closed doors, and how the most ordinary seeming people can harbor the most extraordinary capacity for evil. In that recognition lies the true legacy of Eleanor, Virginia, and Margaret Ashcroft, not as mere victims of tragedy, but as silent witnesses whose story continues to warn us about the dangers of unquestioned authority and the terrible price of looking away. As the sun sets over what was once the Ashcroft property, the empty lot stands as a void in the landscape, a space where no one builds, where nothing grows quite right, where even the most skeptical visitors report feeling watched. Perhaps it is merely the power of suggestion, the mind's tendency to find patterns in randomness and meaning in coincidence. Or perhaps, in some subtle way that defies rational explanation, the echo of what happened there persists, a reminder that some wounds never truly heal, some stories never truly end, and some silences speak more loudly than words ever could. The Ashcroft sisters disappeared on a warm summer evening in 1921. What happened afterward has been pieced together from fragments of evidence, contradictory testimonies, and the slow revelations of time. Their story reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural creatures, but ordinary people whose darkness goes unrecognized until it's too late. And perhaps most disturbingly, it forces us to consider how many similar stories remain buried, their victims forgotten, their perpetrators unpunished, their truths never told. In the words attributed to Margaret Ashcroft in her purported final testament, the worst prison is not made of bars and locks, but of silence and fear. I escaped the house, but I never truly left it behind. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again.